What's going on, everybody? It's your boy Numbskull here, back again with a submitted trip report. This one comes from a subscriber and is detailed whilst not being overly lengthy. It's a really good representation of a quite niche combination. DXM, psilocybin mushrooms, and weed have been into the experience. Overall, I think you're going to enjoy, and I hope you do. Without further ado, let's get into it. I was 23 years old at the time of this experience, which took place in late 2022. I'm male, about 5'10", and roughly 180 pounds. I had previous experience with both dissociatives and psychedelics separately, including DXM on multiple occasions and psilocybin mushrooms a handful of times, but never combined. This experience involved dextromethorphan, excuse me, and psilocybin mushrooms taken together, with cannabis smoked later during the peak. The day itself felt strangely calm from the moment I woke up, like the air had weight to it. I didn't feel anxious or overly excited, just quietly aware that the experience ahead was likely to be intense in a way that demanded respect. I was in a familiar indoor setting, comfortable with nothing pressing to do and nowhere to be. The intention wasn't spiritual enlightenment or escapism so much as curiosity. Curiosity about how these two radically different altered states might interact inside the same mental space. When the substances were taken, there was nothing dramatic about it. No ceremony, no countdown. I settled in, put some low music on, and waited. The first noticeable effects to arrive were unmistakably psilocybin in character. There was a softening of perception, like the edges of the world were being gently sanded down. Colors began to feel warmer rather than brighter, and patterns in the room seemed to breathe in slow organic cycles. My thoughts were still mostly linear, but I could already sense that familiar mushroom logic beginning to take hold, the kind where ideas feel emotionally true before they feel intellectually sound. My body felt light but grounded at the same time, and there was a faint sense of anticipation humming underneath it all. As time passed, the DXM began to slowly assert itself, not abruptly, but like a tide creeping in under the surface. The first sign wasn't dissociation yet, but a subtle emotional distancing. I noticed that my internal narration had quieted, like the volume knob had been turned slightly down. The mushroom visuals became less nature-oriented and more abstract. The room no longer just breathed, it subtly rearranged itself when I wasn't paying direct attention. Depth perception began to feel unreliable, as though my eyes were feeding my brain information that arrived half-processed. Once both substances were fully present, the experience shifted into something that felt categorically different from either alone. My body awareness fragmented in a way I recognized from dissociatives. My limbs felt optional, like they belonged to me conceptually but not physically, and at the same time, the emotional sensitivity and introspective pull of psilocybin was very much alive. This combination produced a strange duality. I felt deeply emotional and strangely detached simultaneously. I could contemplate personal memories without being overwhelmed by them, yet they still carried weight and meaning. Visually, the world stopped making conventional sense. The typical mushroom visuals, flowing patterns, organic symmetry, were still there, but they were flattened and digitalized by the dissociative aspect. Surfaces didn't just ripple, they drifted away from themselves, like textures peeling off objects and hovering independently. There was a subtle frame-dropping effect to reality, as though my perception was running at a slightly lower refresh rate. When I moved my head, the world lagged behind for a fraction of a second before snapping back into place. Time became difficult to track in a way that felt qualitatively different from either substance on its own. Mushrooms often stretch time by making moments feel fuller, while DXM tends to smear it into a fog. Here it felt like time had lost its direction entirely. I wasn't moving forward through it, I was sitting inside of it. Minutes felt thick, but not long. I would think about checking the time, forget why I wanted to, and then realize that the concept of now had replaced past and future almost completely. At some point, my internal monologue fractured into layers. One layer was still capable of forming sentences and recognizing my environment, understanding that I was under the influence of substances. Another layer operated entirely on feeling and imagery. Thoughts didn't arrive as words, but as fully formed emotional impressions, like understanding something all at once without needing to explain it. This wasn't ego death so much as ego diffusion. My sense of identity became porous, flexible, and optional. Emotionally, the experience was surprisingly neutral, even peaceful. There was none of the sharp euphoria sometimes associated with DXM on its own, and none of the raw emotional intensity psilocybin can produce. Instead, there was a calm and observational quality to everything. I felt like a passenger watching my own consciousness reassemble itself moment by moment. At times I forgot what my face felt like, or whether I was sitting or reclining, yet there was no panic attached to that loss. As the peak set in fully, the dissociative qualities began to dominate spatial perception. The room felt vast and distant, like I was viewing it from the inside of my skull rather than occupying it physically. Sounds became extremely strange. Music no longer moved from beginning to end, but existed as a looping structure, with certain moments folding back into others. Individual instruments felt separated spatially, floating in different areas of my awareness rather than coming from the same source. This was when I decided to smoke cannabis. The effect was immediate, but not overwhelming. The cannabis didn't so much intensify the visuals as it deepened the sense of immersion. It added warmth back into the experience, softening the cold clinical edge that DXM sometimes brings. My body sank further into itself, and the dissociation became more dreamlike than mechanical. Thoughts slowed even further, and whatever remained of ordinary logic began to dissolve. With cannabis in the mix, the visual field became layered. Closed-eye visuals were complex and slow-moving, composed of geometric tunnels, shifting symbols, and layered patterns that felt as though they had depth and distance. Open-eye visuals became more subtle, but more convincing. Objects no longer just looked different, they felt different, as though their purpose and meaning had subtly changed. A chair wasn't a chair so much as something meant for stopping. At one point, I became deeply fascinated by the idea that consciousness itself might simply be a temporary alignment of sensory processes. This wasn't a frightening realization. It felt obvious, almost mundane. I wasn't losing myself. I was simply noticing how arbitrary the boundaries of me really were. The dissociative backdrop allowed these thoughts to exist without emotional overwhelm, while the psilocybin provided the symbolic framework to explore them meaningfully. There were moments where language completely collapsed. I couldn't have explained what I was experiencing even if I wanted to. Not because it was too complex, but because explanation itself felt irrelevant. Experience no longer needed translation. I existed in a state of passive awareness, observing sensations arise and disappear without attaching narrative to them. This state lasted an indeterminate amount of time, long enough that when I finally noticed myself thinking in sentences again, it felt like surfacing from deep water. Gradually, the intensity began to taper. The dissociative elements receded first, returning my sense of bodily ownership in slow increments. My hands felt like mine again, then my legs, then my position in space. The mushroom effects lingered longer. Colors remained warm, thoughts stayed flexible, and there was a gentle afterglow of introspection. The cannabis smoothed the come-down, making the transition back to normal consciousness feel gradual rather than abrupt. By the time I felt mostly sober, there was no dramatic revelation or life-altering conclusion waiting for me. Instead, there was a quiet sense of having observed something honestly. The combination hadn't been euphoric or mystical, so much as observational and strange in a uniquely neutral way. It felt like having briefly stepped outside the usual hierarchy of perception, where emotion, identity, and sensation compete for dominance, and seeing them coexist without one overpowering the others. Looking back, what stood out most was how complementary the substances were in specific ways. Psilocybin provided meaning, symbolism, and emotional depth, while DXM acted as a diffuser, preventing those elements from becoming overwhelming or chaotic. Cannabis acted like a bridge, reconnecting the body to the experience and adding warmth where things might have otherwise felt sterile. The result wasn't additive, so much as transformative. not simply DXM plus mushrooms, but it was a state that felt distinct from either, with its own character and internal logic. And that's going to be the end of the report. What makes the DXM and the psilocybin combination unique is that it blends two very different alterations of consciousness into something that isn't just stronger, but fundamentally different. Psilocybin amplifies emotional significance, symbolism, and intuitive thinking, while DXM creates psychological distance, dissociation, and a reduction of internal narration. Together, the dissociative effects can buffer the emotional intensity of mushrooms, making deep thoughts feel observable rather than overwhelming, while the psychedelic effects prevent DXM from becoming flat or purely mechanical. Adding cannabis during the peak tends to reintroduce bodily warmth and immersion, smoothing the headspace and making the experience feel more dreamlike. The result isn't pure euphoria or chaos, it's a detached yet meaningful state that allows introspection without emotional overload, which is something neither substance typically produces on its own. I enjoyed reading this, and if you enjoyed hearing it, leave a like and maybe comment what substance you'd like to hear cover next. And if you want to support the channel a lot and you like my content, do consider subscribing. Every single person that joins this party helps me out more than you all could ever know. Don't forget to pop on those post notifications to make sure you don't miss anything I got cooking up. And with that, I will see all of you in the next one. Peace!